Hello, good people. It's great to be back with you. And I'm going into the next section of Joseph Ratzinger's Introduction to Christianity. Ratzinger is getting ready now to discuss the revelation of God to Moses in the book of Exodus. Before he does that, he wants to say something about the way the creed of Christians, and in particular the first line of the Apostles' Creed, I believe in God the Father, the Almighty, the Creator, the way that line in the creed is in continuity with the profession of faith of Israel in the one true God. And he wants to show that it is in continuity not only in what is being professed, but also in what is being renounced. So he's got some interesting things to say about that. He says that behind these words, I believe in God the Father, the Almighty, the Creator, behind these words, quote, stands Israel's daily profession of faith, the Christian form of which it represents. Hear, O Israel, Yahweh thy God is an only God. With its first words, the Christian creed takes up the creed of Israel and takes up with it Israel's striving, its experience of faith, and its struggle for God. We meet here an important law of the history of religion and belief, which always proceeds by linked steps. There is never complete discontinuity. Okay, so he has pointed out that the faith of Israel is in some kind of continuity. There's never complete discontinuity between the previous faith and the new faith or the new revelation. Now, what does he then have to say about the relation between the faith of Israel and the faith of the peoples in surrounding nations? He says that the faith of Israel is certainly something new in comparison with the faith of the surrounding peoples. Nevertheless, it is not something that has fallen from heaven. It takes shape in the conflict with this faith of other peoples, in the combative selection and reinterpretation that is both continuation and transformation. So he does see that Israel, in what Israel's making it her own statement of belief, is actually in a sort of dialogue and competition with, or comparison with, the religions round about her. It's not something that merely falls out of heaven, although he is not averse to saying that it is a revealed faith. He does believe that, but he wants to show here the human element of how it is developed. He goes on to say, Yahweh thy God is an only God. This fundamental profession, which forms the background to our creed, making it possible, is in its original sense a renunciation of the surrounding gods. It is a profession in the fullest sense of this word. That is, it is not the registration of one view alongside others, but an existential decision. As a renunciation of the gods, it also implies the renunciation both of the deification of political powers and of the deification of the cosmic cycle. If one can say that hunger, love, and power are the forces that motivate man, then one can point out as an extension of this observation that the three main forms of polytheism are the worship of bread, and by this he would mean the worship of those deities that control the cycles of the earth and control the crops, etc. The worship of bread, the worship of love, and the idolization of power. All three paths are aberrations. Why does he say they're aberrations? Because they make absolutes out of what is not in itself the absolute. They thereby make slaves of men. This is a theme that Ratzinger will return to frequently. Remember, he grew up under the oppression of the Nazis in Germany, and then he is, as he's coming of age and he's in school and, you know, college and everything, there's the great turmoil with the communists in Europe. And so one of his themes that he always has is how religious commitments are related to human freedom. Israel's profession is a declaration of war on this threefold worship, and thus an event of the greatest importance in the liberation, in the history of man's liberation. It is, at the same time, a declaration of war on the multiplication of the divine in general. It is a renunciation of gods of one's own, of the deification of one's own possessions, a renunciation of the attempt to keep one's own possessions safe, a renunciation of the fear that tries to tame the mysterious by worshiping it, and an assent to the one God of heaven as the power that guarantees everything. It signifies the courage to entrust oneself to the power that governs the whole world without grasping the divine in one's hands. So we could go back to what he said previously when he talked about that initial encounter of man with God, that turning or that conversion, in which one encounters God and then realizes that one is comprehended by God, but one cannot comprehend God. One cannot grasp God, not with the intellect, not with the hands. One cannot manipulate God. Now, this is different from the way that pagans saw their relationships with their gods, which often involved a kind of transactional relationship. They believed they could kind of manipulate their gods, and that is not the God of the Jews or the God of the Christians, not a God who can be manipulated. So now he wants to say, what does this do in history? He's already alluded to the fact that it is so important for the concept of man's freedom and man's liberation. Well, he says that this starting point, which stems from the faith of Israel, has not been fundamentally changed in the early Christian creed. So the early Christian creed is continuing this. It says, the acceptance of the creed, what we talked about before, the symbol, signifies an existential decision with serious consequences. The consequences are not merely personal to the person who accepts that faith, but it is going to have consequences that are going to change the entire course of human history. It says, for whoever assented to this creed renounced at the same time the laws of the world to which he belonged. Remember, when Israel said her creed, that was renouncing all of the pagan gods. Something similar happens when the Christians begin to say their creed. It says, he renounced the worship of the ruling political power. He renounced the worship of pleasure and the cult of fear and superstition that ruled the world. It is no coincidence that the struggle over Christianity flared up in the field thereby defined and grew into a struggle over the whole shape of public life in the ancient world. Now, it's difficult for us to really understand the mentality of people who lived before Christianity took hold, because there are many things about the Christian worldview that we take for granted, even those of us among us who are not Christians. There's many elements of thought that we have just inherited. It's the water in which we swim. And one of the things that's so important to recognize is the fear and superstition that rule the world. Don't really recognize how true that is, how fearful people were of their gods, and they believed Romans had gods for everything. You know, you had one god for the door and another god for the door frame, and then a god for the threshold and a god for the stoop in front of your house. Every single thing had its god. And you constantly had to worry about whether you were pleasing these gods or not. It kept people in a great state of anxiety and fear, and constantly trying to figure out how they could propitiate all these different gods that they have. So when Christianity came along and people were liberated from that multiplication of the divine, it changed their entire psychology. Now he wants to talk for a minute about the way the Christians would refuse to engage in the worship of the emperor as one of the main immediate public manifestations of this new freedom was that. And this is what he says. It is only too easy for us to regard the Christian refusal, even if it meant the loss of one's life, to take any part in the cult of the emperor as a piece of fanaticism appropriate to an early period, excusable perhaps for this reason, but certainly not to be imitated today. Then so he's being just a tad sarcastic in that. Christians rejected even the most harmless forms of the cult, such as putting one's name down on the list of those contributing to the cost of a sacrificial victim, and were ready to risk their lives by such an action. Today, in a case like this, one would distinguish between the unavoidable act of civic loyalty and the real religious act in order to find an acceptable way out, and at the same time to take account of the fact that, after all, heroism cannot be expected of the average man. So he's really kind of nailed the way that modern people rationalize their decisions, right? So then he goes on to say, it is important to realize that this refusal, going back talking about the early Christians, this refusal was far from being a piece of narrow-minded fanaticism, and that it changed the world in a way in which it can only be changed by the readiness to suffer. And then he goes on to say, faith is not a matter of playing with ideas, but it's a very serious business. It says no and must say no to the absoluteness of political power and to the worship of the might of the mighty in general. And then he quotes a line from the Magnificat, the prayer of the Virgin Mary in Luke, the first chapter. He has put down the mighty from their thrones. In this sense, the profession, there is only one God, is, precisely because it has itself no political aims, a program of decisive political importance. Through the absoluteness it lends the individual from his God, and through the relativization to which it relegates all political communities in comparison, it forms, listen carefully to what he says here, it forms the only definitive protection against the power of the collective. Okay, so he's talked about how Christianity liberates man from the absolutization of political power, liberates the individual, shows that it is the individual who has absoluteness from God. The individual has his own absoluteness that he gets from God, and that gives him the power to stand against the collective, to stand against the political power. Now he wants to talk about another kind of power that has a tendency to enslave men, and what the Christian creed has to say about that. He says, much the same could be demonstrated in the realm of the striving for the true pattern of human love as against the false worship of sex and eros, which was and still is responsible for just as great an enslavement of humanity as the misuse of power. He says more than mere imagery is involved when Israel's fall from faith is depicted again and again in the prophets by the image, and here he puts the word image in quotation marks, image of adultery, as though, well, it's an image of adultery, but maybe it's more than an image of adultery, right? Not only did these alien cults almost always involve cult prostitution so that they could literally be described as adultery, these outward manifestations also revealed their inner tendency. The unity finality and indivisibility of the love between man and woman can, in the last analysis, only be made a reality and understood in the light of belief in the unity and indivisibility of the love of God. Okay, so what he's saying here is that the vision of God and his relationship with man is going to have a profound effect on the human conception of love between man and woman and of what marriage is and what marriage is for. Now he's writing in 1968, so he's writing near the kind of like the beginning of the sexual revolution. Well, the sexual revolution had actually already happened in Germany. The United States came late to the party because it had already started in Germany, actually even started before World War II in Germany. And so he was quite familiar with the effects of it, especially being a college professor and dealing with young people. He said, "We are beginning to understand more and more clearly today that this concept of love, meaning the Christian concept of the indissolubility of marriage," that is, when we say indissolubility of marriage, it is what Jesus said, "What God has put together, let no man put apart." So he says, "This concept of love is by no means a philosophically deducible, self-supporting principle, and to a large extent it stands or falls with belief in the one God." Okay, I think this is a very important point. This has come up even in a couple of my conversations with John Beveke, because I've asked him, in the religion without a religion, how do you ground the sacredness of the human family and of marriage? And what Ratzinger is saying here is that we cannot get to what Christians believe about marriage, what the Bible says about marriage. We cannot get to it philosophically. It stands or falls with belief in the one God. Interesting. Then he says, "We're also coming to understand more and more clearly that the apparent liberation of love and its conversion into a matter of impulse mean the delivery of man to the autonomous powers of sex and eros, to whose merciless slavery he falls victim just when he is under the illusion that he has freed himself. When he eludes God, capital G, the gods, small g, put out their hands to grasp him." Now, this is interesting because, of course, many of the psychological and emotive powers and impulses of man were understood or were conceptualized by ancient people as gods, right? So what he's saying here is that when we get away from the one God, the God of the Bible, these other gods seem to reach out and start grabbing at us. And he says, the renunciation of the first few Christian centuries has turned out to be so effective historically that the gods have disappeared irrevocably. To be sure, the powers expressed in them have not disappeared, nor has the temptation to regard them as absolutes. So we do have a situation where people are still definitely coming under these powers, may even feel themselves to be possessed by them, whether it's whether it has to do with political ideology or it has to do with sex. We have, sex addicts today. And he says that there's a temptation to regard them as absolutes. There's a temptation to engage in worship like people did in pagan times. There's a temptation to engage in a kind of worship or devotion to these things. And then he says, both facts, that is the fact that these gods have disappeared and the fact that people are still being subject to them in a way, are part of the basic human situation. and express the truth of polytheism. And he has truth in quotation marks. We are threatened no less than the people of ancient times by the tendency to make absolutes of power, bread, and arrows. But even if the gods of those days are still powers that try to claim absoluteness, they have irrevocably lost the mask of divinity and must now show themselves unmasked in their true profanity. And here we have a fundamental difference between pre-Christian and post-Christian paganism. So what Ratzinger is saying here is that Christianity has really and truly taught the world that sex is not a god, that the king is not a god, that there is not a god to, there are not gods to make sacrifices to get your crops to grow, things like that. Christianity has really taught mankind this, and we cannot go back. Even in post-Christian times, we're not going to go back to the belief in these pagan deities, even though we may still be enthralled by these powers, but we now know that they are psychological powers within man, rather than something that lies outside of him. So where does that leave us, and how does that kind of tie in with the conversation that we've been having in our little corner of the internet? Well, here's what I think. I think that men now know that their passions, their greeds, and their lusts are not gods, even when they feel possessed. And they have a sense now, because of Christianity and what it has taught them, they have a sense that these things are not really worthy of them. Having been told by Christianity for 2,000 years that they are destined for glory, they feel diminished when asked to settle for mere domination by their lower impulses or by consumerism. And how does that leave them? I think that ends up leaving them in a meaning crisis. What do you think? You can let me know. Until we get together again, which we will be discussing the revelation of God to Moses in Exodus. Till we get together again, treat yourself as though you are someone you are responsible for helping, because you are responsible. So am I, and together we are making the world. Bye for now. Thanks so much for watching.